Welcome to the Well-Being Manifesto podcast, where we translate science and experience into realistic and sustainable ways of living. In each episode, we offer clear and practical strategies to support all aspects of well-being that matter to you, whether in your home, your community, or place of work. The Well-Being Manifesto is hosted by Dr. Moain Dabrh and Dr. David Freeman, who have spent their careers advancing whole person care. Join us as we focus on real lives and real change, with less hype, more truth, better living.
Welcome one and all to the Well-Being Manifesto podcast. I am Moain Dabrh.
And I'm Dave Freeman. Today's guest is Marion Nestle, professor, author, and one of the world's most influential voices on food policy and public health. Her work, Food to Politics and What to Eat, and Unsavory Truth, and her new book, What to Eat Now, has reshaped how we understand the intersection of science, policymaking, systems, and personal choice. Professor Nestle, it is a privilege to have you with us.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Professor, we'd like to start this with a question about getting to know the person, the origins. And it's almost asking you to sum up your life in few minutes. But as a person, you've spent decades at the crossroads of nutrition, politics, and science. How did your personal experience kind of led you to this place that you are at now?
I grew up in a political family. And they were very concerned, and I was taught from an early age to care about other people and to make sure that there was equality of opportunity. And those values made a lot of sense to me. And so I've retained them, and I've been lucky enough to be able to act on them occasionally.
I remember hearing you mentioning about your own personal trajectory, career trajectory, and as a woman in science and getting into this field, can you share with us a little more about that personal journey and how it intersected with the professional kind of field back in the day and where it is now is in comparison to now?
Yeah, I grew up at a time when opportunities for women were very limited. And I had very low expectations for what I could do and what my options were. I never thought that I had much in the way of agency. But I was interested in science, and so I did a doctorate in molecular biology. And then took a teaching job. That's a long story in itself. I took a teaching job and I was handed a nutrition course to teach. And that was life-changing. I mean, I just really loved it because I could see right away. I was teaching undergraduate biology, and it's a lot more fun to teach nutrition to biology students than it is to teach cell and molecular biology because everybody eats and they could relate to it. And I had a fabulous class who were really enthusiastic and wrote wonderful papers. Students could still write research papers in those days. And I've never looked back.
Is there any person who also had, in addition to your family as a support system, is there any person professionally who supported you at the beginning of your career and helped at least remove some of the obstacles that especially women have encountered?
That would be the only one I could think of. I mean, I never had a mentor and really didn't have anybody that I was close to who was helpful with that until pretty late in my career, in my mid-career, when Phil Lee, who was a former Assistant Secretary for Health, was willing to listen to me cry in his office and gave me the best advice I ever got from anybody, which I had sense enough to take. I mean, I was in a very, very difficult situation at UCSF. I had gone there as a trailing spouse, which is never a comfortable position. And when all of that fell apart and things at the absolute low point in my life, my job was breaking up, my marriage was breaking up, he gave me really excellent advice and also introduced me to the person I went to work for after all that. So Yeah, an absolutely wonderful man who was like that with everybody. It was nothing special for me. He did that for many, many, many people. And it was one of the few places at the medical school where if you were so upset and cried, you didn't get kicked out. Crying is against the rules in medical schools.
We know that too well sometimes, and I love that sometimes it takes just one person to make a huge difference in a personal life. So we are grateful also to him.
And I can tell you the story.
Yes, I would. I would love to hear,
Yeah,
and also the elements of the advice that you can share from that story.
yeah, sure. I was an associate dean at the medical school, but without a portfolio. This was at UCSF, and it was a new dean had come in. It was clear that we were not getting along. He couldn't figure out what I did, and there was an incident in which the dean yelled at me in front of everybody in the office for something that was absolutely not my fault. And when I went to see Phil Lee, he said, "You have to resign." More tears. And here's how you do it. And he said, you should go to the dean and tell him that you know it's not working, and ask him for 2 years of salary support, and tell him that you're going to go to public health school and you'd like him to support you in public health school. I was absolutely shocked. I had no idea such things were possible. And when I worked up the courage, I went to see the dean, read the script, and it took him about 10 milliseconds to realize what a good idea it was. And so I had 2 years of salary support to get me through the next 2 years. And I had to promise that I would be gone when those 2 years were over. But that gave me 2 years to go to public health school, get a nutrition credential, which I badly needed, have a wonderful time in public health school, and get out of there on the appropriate date.
That's a smart exchange, and in many ways you've gained your credentials. Even though I can't imagine how sometimes these circumstances, the unfairness or injustice that comes with that sensation, and that experience. I'm curious, what advice would you give people who are still be experiencing such?
Don't take jobs as a trailing spouse. It's a really bad idea. And I had been offered a job at another university where I would not have been a trailing spouse. And if I had realized what a dangerous position it was to be in, I would have taken that job. But it involved commuting, and I didn't want to commute, and this seemed so much easier. And I had young kids and needed to spend a lot of time with them. But if I had known what I was getting myself into, the miracle in retrospect was not that I got fired, or eased out. The miracle was that I had lasted as long as I did. This was 8 years into my time there. But I learned a lot. It was a very good experience overall.
And Professor Nestle, continuing in that sort of advice and guidance, you've famously written that food is much more than nutrients. It's about power. Where do you see the biggest power imbalance today, in industry, policy, or academia?
Well, there are power imbalances everywhere, but if you want a healthy population that's eating well, people have to have enough money to buy healthy food, and they don't. Large numbers of people in our society don't have access to healthy food, mainly because they don't have enough money to buy it. Also because their cultural background may argue against, if you grow up eating nothing but junk food, then you think that's normal. I think we have a situation in the United States now where we have corporate capture of government. And as long as corporations call the shots, they've got the power. Pretty hard to fight back on that. I tell people that if they're trying to eat healthfully in today's food system, they are fighting an entire food system on their own, because the food system is set up to get everybody to eat way too much of the worst possible foods.
This is an important point when we talk about the systems challenges, and maybe to tie that with also the public understanding and also their trust in nutrition science and how it impacts policy. I'm curious, as someone who have been immersed in this extensively and have witnessed nutrition guidelines and how the response, and also people are confused often, and nutrition science gets somewhat an unfair, maybe a reputation. So how do you approach these public conversations that you can establish trust and without oversimplifying the complexity of all of this issue?
Oh, I like to oversimplify. So first of all, on trust, I get asked the question all the time, who do we trust in nutrition? My answer to that is very simple. Me, of course. Of course. I think nutrition advice is really, really simple. And it's so simple that I'm fond of quoting the journalist Michael Pollan, who can do it in 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. It's really not any more complicated than that, as long as you understand that by food, he means real food, relatively
Whole foods.
unprocessed, minimally processed foods, and not what we're now calling ultra-processed foods. And if most of your diet is minimally processed foods in whatever mix you want, and you're eating plenty of plant foods as part of that, and you're not overeating calories, you don't have to worry about your diet. Just enjoy your food. It's really that simple. And if it seems more complicated, it's because of the other point you mentioned, which was nutrition research. And I would say that nutrition research is exceptionally difficult to do, and its difficulty is hugely underestimated. Everybody thinks they're an expert on nutrition, and they have no idea how hard the studies are to do, because you can't control people's diets unless you lock them up. And locking people up to control their diets is hugely expensive. People won't agree to be locked up for more than a month. And the studies that are done under locked metabolic wards are very, very important, because they're the only really well-controlled studies that we have in nutrition. Everything else is observational. And the trouble with observational research is that you can't control for all the variables. So I think the most intellectually important question in nutrition is, how do you figure out what people are eating? And if you don't know what people are eating, you can't figure out what diet has to do with health. So very difficult.
And I want to touch on one thing that was brought up just a minute ago, which was the ultra processed food. It's been said that these ultra processed foods now make up more than 60% of the average American diet. Why have they become so dominant, do you think?
Food industry marketing. I mean, we can go back to 1980 when everything changed, when President Reagan was elected on a deregulatory agenda. And there were a lot of things that got deregulated. One of the things that happened between 1980 and 2000 was that the number of calories in the food supply increased from 3,200 per capita to 4,000 per capita. That's not what people were eating, but it's what was available in the food supply. Food companies had to sell that. And that's twice as much food as as the population needs on average. Food companies had to find ways to increase their sales, also because of something else that happened in around 1980, and that was the advent of the shareholder value movement, in which investors said, enough of this blue chip stock, slower returns on lifetime investment. We don't want that. We want higher returns on investment. We want it now, and we're going to make our CEOs, our business CEOs, dependent on growth in stock value reported to Wall Street 4 times a year. And Wall Street bought that. And at that point, food companies, which were already trying to sell their food in a overheated environment, now had to not only make a profit, but grow their profits every 90 days. And so they looked for ways to sell food that they had never done before. And the most obvious one is bookstores. It used to be that you weren't allowed, you get thrown out of a bookstore if you try bringing a cup of coffee into it. Now every bookstore has a cafe. Libraries have cafes. And they made larger portions. And I think that larger portions alone are a sufficient explanation for the sharp rise in prevalence of obesity that occurred in that 20-year period. Because if I had one concept I could get across, it would be that larger portions have more calories. And I remember when the large portions came in, when the enormous muffins suddenly started appearing, enormous bagels. And now everybody's used to that size, but the mini muffins, what are now considered mini muffins and mini bagels, are the size that people used to
What
eat.
used to be.
That's what it used to. That's what
Yes.
it used to. And so once you get used to larger portions, you think that any large portion has 100 calories because people can't estimate calories. But bagels used to be 200 calories and now they're 800. Muffins were 200 calories. Now they're 800. And larger portions alone are enough to account for the rise in calorie intake that occurred during that period. People started eating more. Guess what? They got fat.
And to piggyback on that or follow up, what levers do you think economic, cultural, behavioral might shift that trend in the opposite direction? It seems like it's been going the wrong direction for a while.
The big driver of a reversal are the GLP-1 drugs. Which, the people who are taking those drugs can't eat a lot. They don't want to eat a lot. They're turned off by large amounts of food. They don't want to eat junk food. They want healthy food and they want it in smaller portions. And food companies are starting to respond to that demand.
Yeah. It is interesting to see how the food industry is responding now to this and the changes. Maybe I want to go back to when you said about oversimplifying just nutritional advice, which we appreciate. I often, when I'm talking to any person, and specifically, especially with patients, I say quantity, quality, and enjoying what you're eating. Those are the three principles. And the core, as you said, it's going back to the basics. And I know even, the biggest nutritional scientists like you and others have always advised that. Now, yes, there is the other context of where it becomes more quote unquote complex is the person's health. If they are dealing with other conditions and other restrictions, then you kind of start to work and tailor these choices. So moving from healthy eating that has been often framed as a personal choice, and people are shamed all the time that they're not making healthy choices and this and that. And would your point in saying the individual is working against the system? Access and affordability also are one of these structural barriers. Can you maybe touch on a little bit on those specific points of access and affordability and what potential practical policies that could make or help with healthier eating choices?
Well, let's start with subsidies because they're worth talking about. The subsidies go to corn and soybeans, basically. And the Department of Agriculture publishes these fabulous graphs, or did publish fabulous graphs on what happens to corn and soybeans in the United States. And it's pretty shocking. Roughly half of the corn that's grown in the United States goes to feed animals. The other roughly half goes to make ethanol for fuel for automobiles. That's pretty shocking. That's where the subsidies go. Hardly any corn is grown to feed people. And similarly with soybeans, the soybeans go for either animal feed or they go for diesel fuel. hardly any soybeans go to feed people. So we are subsidizing commodity crops that are not really grown to feed people. I think we could completely change that and subsidize food for people. What a concept.
Can you talk, because I would love for our listeners to understand more about the farming challenges in the United States and the land challenges and how it relates to food policy, equity, and accessibility. If you can educate us a little more about that.
Well, I'm not sure what you're asking, but the structure of the agricultural system in the United States has been towards increasing consolidation. There used to be millions of small farmers in the United States, but they went out of business because the whole system is set up where farmers don't have a market for their products, or the market for their products is at such a low price that it costs them more to grow the stuff than they get in return. And that system has never changed. So the big agricultural producers, many of whom don't live anywhere near the place where the stuff is being grown, they just own it, and things are increasingly mechanized. That system of consolidation and mechanization has emptied out the Midwest of the United States. So you drive through the Midwest, it's all ghost towns, closed up movie theaters, no schools, no hospitals, no life, because there are no people there. And now that we're getting rid of immigrants, there really won't be anybody there. And the Department of Agriculture has never done anything to try to fix that. There are token payments to fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables are considered specialty crops in the United States, and the Department of Agriculture doesn't. They go under the horticulture title in the Farm Bill. They're ignored, or there's just token support of that, but those are the foods that people are actually eating. And we import an enormous quantity of fruits and vegetables into this country, and also seafood. There's never been a attempt to try to make the United States self-supporting on food in terms of its production. And in fact, I've heard people at the Department of Agriculture say it's too expensive to grow food in the United States, and we shouldn't. We should use farmland for housing and recreation, and buy our food from low and middle income countries where it can be produced at a much lower cost. I think that's a very short-sighted strategy.
Yeah, I was just going to say this strikes a chord about the as you mentioned, the big agriculture. My father's side of the family were farmers, and I can tell you that if there's extremely hard work, it comes from trying to get up supremely early and and raise food and harvest it. So it's just it's kind of an ecosystem unto itself, as you mentioned. In many ways, it seems like the United States has deindustrialized that aspect. I mean, people are not empowered to grow their own food in their own garden, because they don't know how. But it's kind of a generational gap. But I wanted to ask, sort of in terms of empowerment, how can journalists, clinicians, policymakers sort of communicate the importance of nutrition and not stoke the flames of these so-called diet wars or other things going on out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because food is considered quotidian, common, everybody eats. When we developed food studies programs at NYU, the first question I got asked was, why would anybody want to study about food? I have to say, since RFK Jr. landed in Health and Human Services, I don't get asked that anymore. But to me, food is totally worth studying. It's an enormous business. It has an enormous influence on health. Billions of people don't get enough. Even more billions get too much of the wrong kind of food. And agriculture has an enormous and not very good impact on the environment. I mean, those are all reasons for very serious study. I think there's much more interest in food and nutrition now than there was 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago.
Mhm.
Although there have always been people who are interested, but it's much more widespread now. And I think that's good. And if RFK Jr. has done anything good at all, it's been to bring a lot of these issues to public attention in a way they've never been brought to public attention before.
The generational shift is also important, and I'm interested in understanding. I read, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I read somewhere that the U.S. agricultural land is not sufficient to produce food to feed the whole population of the United States. Therefore, if we want to pursue that, we have to find a way that we can invest in that agricultural resource, but also at the same time continue to balance that with quote unquote industrial support.
Yeah.
What is your take on that?
I would argue that can't possibly be true, because if you just look at corn, soybeans, wheat, and I don't know, I can't remember what the fourth one is. Together, those have been rice, maybe. Those have been estimated to produce 15,000 calories a day per capita. Okay, a lot of it, but that's not how it's used. It's used for animals, or it's used for ethanol, or it's used for diesel, or it's used for non-food purposes. And a lot of it is exported. So that what's left in the United States is 4,000 calories a day per capita, which is still twice what everybody needs. And that means that waste is an enormous amount of food waste is built into that system. 2,000 calories a day in food waste on average is built into that system. Because if the 2,000 calorie average applies to everybody of every age, including little tiny babies and sedentary elderly people. So I don't think that's true. I don't know. I have a garden in two places. I have a garden on my terrace in Manhattan and also a garden upstate. And we can't possibly eat the amount of food that we're producing on it. It's only what we're producing, but it's very easy to produce food. That's why school gardens are so important. It teaches kids how easy this is to do. Yeah. You put the seeds in the ground, you water it, they grow.
You touched on a great word that I personally consider a cultural stigma, especially here in the United States, which is the waste. It is astounding and heartbreaking to see the amount of food waste that happens every single day in every place in comparison to the number of people who cannot have a decent meal at all sometimes, or a meal at all. So
those things aren't related is the problem. Everything is in the wrong place, or it's done in the wrong way. So, there are lots and lots of groups in the United States that are gleaning and harvesting and trying to get food, the wasted food, to people who can use it. But 70% of the food waste occurs at the production level. And that's where the intervention really needs to go.
Why are fruit and vegetables not supported when you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, they don't have political clout. Beef is beef. Doesn't matter who raises it. Beef is beef. Dairy foods are dairy foods. Corn is corn. But if you're looking at specialty crops, peach growers view apple growers as competitors, or plum growers as competitors. And so they've never been able, it's a bunch of much, much smaller producers on much narrower profit margins. And they've never been able to join together into coalitions that have enough political clout to get any political power. And also they're in different states. The power of the meat industry was once explained to me as cattle are grown in every state in the United States, and every state has 2 senators. So therefore the meat industry has an enormous amount of clout because they are constituents in every senatorial district. And that's not true of fruits and vegetables.
Mm.
Fruits and vegetables are grown in California. I mean, that's, you know, in other places, but mainly in California. Iowa used to grow fruits and vegetables, but it was a long time ago. Now they just do corn and soybeans.
Is there something related also to, and this is a different question, because we often see the debate between eating organic versus non-organic or GMO and other food options, and there's a lot to counsel individuals about oversimplifying that, but also the fact that the challenges that growing organic food faces on a larger scale and scaling that. What can you talk about that?
Well, I'm greatly in favor of organics. I think everybody should be growing organics. Organics should be the basis, the absolute bottom line for how we produce food. And then on top of that, we should be adding regenerative requirements that mean putting back into the soil what got taken out of it, which many organic producers do, but not all. And the stricter the organic rules are, the more organics are trusted, and I'm greatly in favor of very strict rules. The organic producers tell me that the difference between what they produce and what conventional agriculture produces, the gap is very small. And that they're perfectly capable of producing a lot of food on the land that they're growing, and they're conserving soil, the stuff they're growing tastes better because the soils are better. I wouldn't argue with that. I think I've seen plenty of evidence for that. I think industrial agriculture is really bad for the environment, and it's really bad for people's health. And I'm not crazy about industrial organics either. So, I mean, if we had smaller scale agriculture, we might be able to repopulate the Midwest. I think that would be.
But that is important, because the independent small farmers are going to say, or they say, it is expensive to grow organic without sufficient support and subsidies. Also, the mass production of it, or the demand, I should say, is not as much. So you have a system that is built against even supporting that idea.
Yeah. If you're a farmer and you're growing food, you need a market. And you need a reliable market. And you need a market that's going to give you enough money to cover the cost of what it costs you to produce the food, plus a little bit so you can have a life. And nobody ever sat down to try to figure out how to do that. I just read in the newspaper this morning that the government is going to bail out industrial agriculture because the tariff situation has made China not buy soybeans from American farmers, and American soybean farmers are about to be bailed out. I mean, it's really okay.
That in many ways happens across the board, and I'm very appreciative of farmers and their work, because it is not an easy job, and to understand that it takes almost 3 years to certify a farm as organic, to my understanding. So the time and the resource that goes into that without any support is an innate challenge. And unless we make these challenges on the policy level, then
we don't subsidize fruit and vegetable production. We just don't. And I would, if I were the czar of agriculture, that's the first thing I would change. But nobody asked me.
No, we actually, that's a great question. I know Dave has a question that he wants to ask you about that.
I think if you had to redesign an element of the food system for tomorrow, would it be labeling, subsidies, education? Where would you start with, and why?
Well, I would start with the agricultural system and completely revamp it. I want an agricultural system that's focused on food production, not feed or fuel, and certainly get the fuel out of it, because that would free up enormous amounts of land for growing real food. And also, it would solve a lot of the environmental problems, because you wouldn't be growing corn in places where it really shouldn't be grown. And you wouldn't be dumping all those chemicals on top of it to kill weeds or to get rid of insects or whatever it is they're doing. So, I think we really need to rethink agriculture for long-term investment purposes. And if we want to have agricultural land that's still growing food in 5, 10, 20, 50 years, we've got to make some changes. And these changes are long overdue. The first thing to do if we're going to have a decent food system is we have to get money out of politics. We have to overturn the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United. I want to see an electoral system in which candidates are only allowed to spend a certain amount of money, and everybody who contributes to that fund has to disclose. And we have a much fairer and much more democratic system. And maybe we could elect officials who are interested in public health rather than corporate health. That would be nice.
That would be very nice.
I want to stop marketing. I want to stop the ability of food companies to market junk foods to kids. There have been many attempts to do that and many calls for that. And always politics has intervened. And food company executives tell me they would love to stop marketing to children, but their stockholders won't let them. We need to think about food as something that everybody needs. It's not a widget. It's not a commodity. It's something that everybody needs for an active, healthy life, and it needs to be treated differently than standard commercial enterprises. At least that's how I see it.
You started this journey with all these wonderful books, from Slow Cooked to Unsavory Truth, which is one of my really all-time favorite books about food policy, and then What to Eat. And soon, your book, What to Eat Now, is out. I would love to hear some of your work on this book. What does it entail? But also maybe an observation of from where you started to where you are now.
Yeah. My book, What to Eat, came out in 2006, and it was a compendium of discussions about food policy and how to think. It's not really a book about what to eat. It's a book about how to think about what to eat. So it's a book about food issues, and I use supermarkets as an organizing device. I went aisle by aisle by aisle through the supermarket and talked about every issue that came up. So that the produce section, I talked about food safety, I talked about organics, I talked about, any kind of thing that you would think about when you're in a produce section of a supermarket. And during the pandemic, I thought, gee, I really need a project to get me through this. Maybe I'll do an updated edition of What to Eat. And I reread What to Eat. I thought, boy, this reads pretty well, holds up pretty well. I bet it'll take me 6 months to charge through a supermarket and update things. Ooh, you have to be careful about that. So 4 years later, the book is being published, and I couldn't believe how much things had changed. I had just never noticed. So there was not a single product that I talked about in What to Eat in 2006 that still existed. I mean, every selection of product that I had that I used as an example of how to talk about food labels or whatever I was talking about, those products no longer exist. So the products had to be changed. And then supermarkets are reorganized. There were things now that didn't exist 20 years ago. The plant-based meats, the enormous variety of plant-based milks. 20 years ago, there was soy milk. Now there are dozens. The drinks used to be all full sugar Coke and Pepsi. Now it's waters of one kind or another. And it's waters with fruit juice, waters with flavors, waters sweetened and not sweetened, waters with alcohol, waters with cannabis. I mean, it's really amazing. It's amazing. And then online shopping is just huge. I mean, just an enormous change, so that a huge chunk of supermarket sales are online. And the online shopping changes the way the marketing is done. The companies are using artificial intelligence algorithms to sell food to people just the way they use TikTok to, to get people to keep scrolling, and we're all completely unprepared for this. Nobody knows any. You don't realize this is happening. So there was plenty to write about, and the publisher had asked me for a 40% change from the previous edition. I think it's a 90% change.
Wow.
I did save a few things that I couldn't bear to get rid of, but mostly it's a completely new book, and that's why it took 4 years. It was an enormous amount of work.
What do you think this reflects? This enormous change reflects on our culture.
Well, companies have to sell food, and they have to be profitable, and they have to report growth in profits every 90 days. To Wall Street, or their CEOs get in trouble, or their stock prices drop, or whatever. As long as CEO compensation is tied to stock prices, that becomes the single goal. So supermarkets run in a really complicated way. I mean, payments from customers are only one of the ways they get paid. They get paid by companies for putting products on particular shelves in particular heights in particular places. They get an enormous amount of money from what are called slotting fees. And if you're a producer of a new food and you want it to be sold in a supermarket chain, it's going to cost you a fortune.
Yeah, it is a profession on its own, the psychology of marketing and the art of marketing. And I remember reading about a couple of brands, how just changing the label shape and the font and the color, how it changed the sales from unrecognizable product to one of the most sold out products.
So Dave, I cover all of that.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are looking forward to reading that book.
It comes out November
11th. Everyone, mark your calendars.
I've already pre-ordered it.
Oh, nice.
Yes. So, I mean, there's so much that we are learning, and appreciate you sharing this. So, as we are wrapping up, we want to ask you a few kind of rapid fire questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So, Professor Nestle, I'd like to ask these quick rapid fire questions. The first one being, what favorite meal that you have would say tell your story?
A salad. Except my favorite food is ice cream. So go
I know ice cream is your I think the collective could agree about ice cream.
Yeah. I think that's a second question. A food myth that just won't die.
That nutrition is complicated.
Beautiful. Third question out. What's the most underappreciated public health policy, do you think?
Ooh, I'm stuck. I never thought about that. That's a question I've never been asked before. The only thing I can think about in public health policy these days is vaccinations. But you want a food policy, I assume. You want a food policy? I'm stuck. I'll have to think about that. Sorry.
Okay, no.
And I think one of the ones you mentioned earlier, right, is we didn't appreciate you mentioned just the fruits and vegetables weren't being subsidized or things like that,
okay.
Right?
Oh, all right. That would work. That one would work. I mean, what I'm mainly concerned about is the inequity in income in this country. If people have enough income, they can buy food. If they don't have enough income, they can't.
That's brilliant.
Can I, Dave, I want to ask a very quick question, yes or no.
Yeah.
Do you feel that SNAP is vilified as a policy and for its value, or do you feel that the SNAP policies are misunderstood for what they serve?
I'm not sure what you're asking, but I'm hearing in that question attitudes about the poor that date back to the English Poor Laws of the early 1600s and late 1500s, where the poor were viewed as poor by choice, not as victims of what families they were born into or bad circumstances. And if you view the poor as undeserving, you will think that they do not deserve SNAP. I look at SNAP as a program that isn't nearly adequate enough. I'm in favor of universal basic income. We've got enough money to do that. We ought to do it. When we did it during the pandemic, it worked really well.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you for answering.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then the last rapid fire question is, what one ingredient would you happily like to see disappear in the food system or otherwise?
You're asking questions that I've never thought of before. I'm an omnivore, and I think, you get to eat what you like as long as you don't eat too much of it. It's really okay. So I can't think of it. Anything artificial. I don't eat anything artificial. So any artificial ingredient, I don't think should be in the food supply.
Maybe that and the earlier question will be in the next newsletter of the Food Politics with reference to the Well-Being Manifesto podcast.
Right.
Well, Professor Nestle, we thank you for your wisdom and courage and sense of humor and tenacity in calling food what it truly is, which is a mirror of our values, our politics, and our priorities. So we appreciate your time in joining us today.
Well, thanks so much. This was really fun.
Appreciate you. For our audience, Professor Marion Nestle, her work, her books, including Food Politics, What to Eat, and What to Eat Now, coming out in November. That is their essential reading for anyone who wants to eat and think with clarity. Oversimplified without complexities. So I would highly encourage you to sign up also for Professor Nestle's newsletter on her website, www.foodpolitics.com. Until next time, inward with courage and outward with compassion.
Thank you for joining the Well-Being Manifesto podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and leave us a comment or review. To learn more about this discussion, visit thewellbeingmanifesto.com. And remember, inward with courage, outward with compassion.